Hello and welcome back. This is the week 9 lecture. So I hope everyone had a good break. If you remember back in the week 8 lecture, before the break, we talked a little bit more about literary analysis and interpretation, the two sort of core components to literary study, what we're focusing on in this class. So we've already been doing some analysis previously, but we got into more detail about, what literary analysis really is, how we can do it. I gave you guys some strategies, some questions to ask, some things to look for, but also we can always look for and talk about the literary elements that we've been discussing all semester. Things like imagery, figurative language, symbolism, characters, etc. So we talked about that. We also talked a little bit about interpretation, which is just your reading of the text, you explaining what the text means, why it is significant. So if we think about analysis as the process of really breaking down a text, looking at individual elements, individual features to better understand how it all works, then interpretation is really the process by which we explain the meaning. That really is what it means for us when we provide our own readings of texts. What does it mean? What's the significance? So obviously, we want to do those things. Those are the things that literary critics and scholars do. So as we learn more about literary study, we want to be engaged in that kind of work. We want to be analyzing and interpreting. So when we do that, we really are producing our own literary criticism. So that's what I want to talk more about beginning this week. Really, for the next 4 weeks, we're going to focus on literary criticism, and we'll talk a little bit about literary theory as well. These are academic disciplines that are obviously very important to the study of literature. So we're going to talk more about what literary criticism is. We're going to learn a few different schools or approaches of literary criticism. A lot of these have been around for a while. They've been very popular methods. They've been used by critics and scholars to study literature for a long time. So they remain popular. In many cases, they're still very much in use. So we're going to be learning about these different critical approaches so that we can use them eventually in future work. We can use these as lenses, ways to look at literature, ways to read literature. They can give us some direction and focus when we sit down to analyze. They can help us zero in on particular features or elements of the literary text. So these are tools. These different critical approaches are tools that we can use later when we are conducting our own literary criticism. But like we were saying last time, the types of people to produce literary criticism are typically going to be professors, scholars who teach literature, also maybe people who run literary journals, other people who work in the field. So these are scholars and critics. In some cases, they might work for more popular publications, but a lot of them are going to be teachers or writers or both. And this is a large body of work. We don't have time to cover all of the different schools or all of the different critical approaches. We're just going to hit some of the big ones, some of the most popular ones. But this is very much a crash course. We're not getting into as much detail as we certainly could, but we're going to spend the next 4 weeks learning more about different critical approaches, beginning this week with formalism and reader response theory. So we're going to learn a little bit more about literary criticism just sort of as a body of knowledge, as a discipline, as a thing, that exists in the world. It's really only existed in its modern form for about 100 years or so. So, the study of literature has only been a staple of American colleges and universities for roughly a century. Prior to that, students would study literature, but not anything remotely contemporary. The literature probably would have been what we call, the classics, like stuff from ancient Greece or ancient Rome, maybe a little bit of something like Shakespeare thrown in. But oftentimes, literature was kind of a means to an end, at least the way it was taught in school. It was typically viewed as a way to better understand other areas of knowledge, like history or philosophy, or even, a way to learn more about an author, an important figure, learn more about that person's life. So for a long time, that's how literature was studied. And it was really only in the mid or sort of early to mid 20th century that we started really studying literature in a different way, in a more systematic, rigorous way. And we started reading a wider variety of literature in school, not just the classics, not just really old stuff. Some of the stuff that they were reading 100 years ago seems old to us, of course, but it was a lot more sort of current and relevant for them. So right as literature becomes sort of enshrined and more institutionalized as a field of study in American schools, we also have the rise of literary criticism. So as the study of literature becomes an academic discipline, we also have to develop techniques and methods for doing the work of literary analysis and interpretation. So that's largely what literary criticism allows us to do. Gives us these different lenses, these different approaches that we can use to do the work. So we don't have to know too much about the history, but we are sort of following a chronological order in our tour of literary criticism, because we're starting with the formalists, and they kind of help to revolutionize the study of literature in many ways. And they're kind of the first recognizable school that develops, right, as literary criticism and the study of literature are developing in this country. So we kind of start with them, and then we're going to work our way up essentially to present day. We're going to cover a lot of the big trends, a lot of the big critical movements or approaches that developed really throughout the second half of the 20th century, and many of them are still very much with us today. So we'll kind of take that tour, and we'll start that tour today. But just keep in mind, even though it's only existed as an academic field for roughly 100 years, literary criticism, just as a general principle or concept, has been around a lot longer than that. I mean, arguably, it's been around as long as literature has been around. And as we know, we can go all the way back to ancient Greece to find the origins of poetry and drama. So literature's been around for a long time, and as long as it's been produced and consumed by people, there's been literary criticism. It hasn't always been as formalized and as official maybe as it is now and as it has been in the modern world, but it's always existed in some form, right? As long as there's works of art, there's always going to be critics. There's always going to be people commenting on the art, writing about it, talking about it, expressing various opinions about it. So that's just human nature. That's been around probably even before recorded history. But we can go back and sort of find a few traditional methods of criticism that have been around for hundreds of years, and they obviously predate the rise of kind of modern literary criticism. So it's important to know a little bit about the older traditional ways, because as we're going to see in a moment, formalism in particular kind of rises up in opposition to some of those older methods. So we need to know a little bit about what came before in order to appreciate the formalists and to understand why they were called the new critics back in the 1930s. They don't seem new to us anymore, of course, but when they came along, what they were doing roughly 100 years ago, it was very new compared to how people had previously approached the study of literature. So let's just quickly go through the three traditional approaches. There's actually more, but we just need to know about these big three because they probably were the most prevalent, the most often used. So there was what's called the historical approach, the biographical approach, and the moral approach. So we'll go through each one, but when people were conducting literary criticism back in earlier eras, back in earlier points in history, and when literature was getting taught in school, it would often be through one of these approaches. So again, literature sort of as a means to an end. Literature as a way to learn something about history or some other field of study. That's often how it was used in previous eras. So the historical approach is pretty easy to understand, and as we're going to notice, it's not gone away. In fact, we're going to learn several weeks from now about new historicism, which is a much more recent critical approach, but it's basically just an update on the old traditional historical approach. So we've always read literature historically. The historical approach just means the critic is focused on historical context. And we can go one of two ways here. They can be focused on the time period in which the text is written. So if we're studying Shakespeare, we might use the context of Elizabethan England, which was the era that he lived in. What were conditions like during that historical period? What was his life like? All that kind of stuff. Or we can focus more on the time period being depicted in the text. So obviously we could use that approach for historical fiction. If we're reading a novel set during World War II, we might want to know a little bit about World War II. We might do a little research, read up on it a little bit so we know better what's going on in the book and sort of what the stakes are and all of the background. So we do this pretty often. A lot of people use a historical lens to approach literature. So that's been done for hundreds and hundreds of years, and we haven't stopped doing it. We've added a few other things to the mix, but we still kind of use the traditional historical approach. Biographical is less commonly used today, although it's not dead. So the biographical approach is very much centered on the author, the life and maybe the career of the author. So now we're approaching the work of literature through the lens of the author's life and career. How does this text fit in to maybe the larger body of work produced by the author? Or what are certain themes or stylistic traits that we can attribute to this author? And then we can find those things in these various texts, and maybe they tell us important things about the author's life. Maybe the literary texts are revealing truths about the author's own life and times. So we still do a little bit of that. A lot of literature teachers will sort of discourage their students from leaning too heavily on biography. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to the formalists, because they're part of the reason why some of us are a little reluctant. We don't have to avoid biography. We can know a little bit about the author, and I think it's always a good idea to do a quick Google search, maybe just read up a little bit on any author that you're reading for any class, just so you know a little bit about their larger career, kind of what types of stuff they did. You can place the text that you're reading in a larger context. That's always helpful, but it's not the only thing, and we certainly don't want to just do nothing but that. But as you know, there's still a lot of biographies about authors, so we remain interested in the lives of artists, sometimes, at least some of us, but it's not as popular of a critical approach now as it once was. And then finally, we have the moral approach. And this should make sense to us as well, because we've all heard of the idea of stories having a moral, some kind of lesson that's supposed to be learned by the readers after finishing the text. So even though we don't always read like that, were certainly aware that that is one way to approach a text. And certainly with like children's literature, I think we often look for morals. Some of you might be familiar with like Aesop's fables. A lot of sort of traditional older forms of narrative writing were sort of intended to deliver some kind of moral, some kind of lesson. But really, all literature was expected to do that in earlier eras. Obviously, not everybody thought that way. There's never complete consensus about things like this. But for a long time, certainly with fiction, but also other types of literature, they were thought of as delivering some kind of moral instruction. That was part of it. That was part of the package. And that's often how critics would approach the text. What is the lesson? What's the importance of the lesson? How does it get expressed? How is it conveyed? And again, we still sort of do that. But as we've moved into the modern world, readers don't always demand morals and lessons the way many readers did hundreds of years ago. And even back then, again, it's debatable as to whether or not all texts would have delivered a moral, but that was often the expectation. In fact, early novels, I don't know if I mentioned this when we were talking about novels, but a lot of early novels in both England and the US were often presented as being sort of educational almost, like providing valuable lessons. Now, part of that was to sort of counter the negative stereotypes that used to surround fiction, and particularly novels. So a lot of those writers would say, hey, I'm actually helping young people or women or whoever the target audience might have been. I'm providing valuable lessons. You can learn something. A lot of times that's just kind of bunk. That was just a marketing ploy, but that is how people often packaged and thought of literature. So that's another approach. You can look for the moral, think about the moral. And again, we still do this certainly with some texts, and almost any text can really be thought of as delivering a moral, even if that's not the primary focus, But if you're watching a thriller, and a couple of people make a series of like bad decisions and it gets them in very tense, scary situations, maybe the moral is don't do the things that they just did. I mean, there's always some kind of lesson that you can extract, especially if you're looking for it. But now, with more modern approaches to literature, that's just maybe a small part of it. Like, we're not necessarily never concerned with the lesson or the moral, but that's not usually our exclusive focus. There's other things to examine. There are always other things to analyze. So we haven't completely abandoned those traditional approaches, but again, you'll notice that they're all focused on things that are a little bit almost separate from the text itself. They're interested in history or the author or the moral, and those are all obviously connected to the text, but they're not the text. They're other things that the text can sort of serve as a delivery system for. So the text is getting us into these other things. And there's other approaches that we're not even talking about that did the same thing. So like a lot of people would read texts in order to understand philosophy, maybe find philosophical concepts working in the literature. Also, linguistics played a big role in earlier literary study. So linguistics is more of like the scientific approach to language, really understanding like grammatical structures, how language works. Not really what we are doing. Not a focus on imagery and figurative language, but more about syntax and semantics. And it's different, really, from modern day literature study. So all of these traditional fields, these traditional approaches would really use literature to illuminate things about other disciplines. History, philosophy, linguistics, maybe theology, if we're reading a religious text or we're finding religious symbolism in a text. That gives us a chance to make a larger argument about theology, or we're focused on the author's life and career. So all of those approaches have value. But once we move into the 20th century, the new critics, the formalists, really decided, we want to appreciate literature as a work of art, not as a means to an end, not as a vehicle that allows us to think more about history or the history of language or the life of this author. And that's the big change that occurred. And that's why they are the new critics, because they were rejecting a lot of these outside contexts that were very important for, the historical approach or the biographical approach. All of those traditional approaches were very much focused on outside contexts, some of the surrounding stuff that surrounded the text, not necessarily the language or the specific features or elements of the text themselves. And that's where the formalists broke with tradition and they started doing something new. But again, just keep in mind that literary criticism has always been around, but only for the last 100 years has it really been sort of established and made official. But a lot of scholars will tell us that, we've been analyzing literature forever. And in fact, we borrow certain ideas from what's called exegesis. And that's the interpretation of religious texts. So we've had biblical exegesis in sort of the Western tradition for a really long time, and we've actually borrowed a lot of key concepts from biblical exegesis. As you can imagine, with religious texts, there's lots of symbolism, there's lots of metaphor, so there's lots of room for analysis and interpretation. So even going back to, the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, you had biblical scholars who would perform this kind of analysis. Exegesis is really largely what we would think of as literary analysis today, because we're doing the same kind of stuff that they were doing. We're just doing it with literary texts. And also legal scholars would engage in a lot of textual interpretation, because again, you can imagine legal documents have to be analyzed. They have to be interpreted. So a lot of the basic concepts of like looking for hidden meanings or interpreting meaning, and certainly with biblical exegesis, like I said, looking for symbolism, looking for metaphors, all of that stuff has been around for a really long time. But again, it was often reserved for stuff that was thought of as a little bit more important than literature, like the Bible or important legal documents. And when we did study literature, we did it in those traditional ways, historically, biographically, or morally. And those all seem a bit limited to us today. So once we get up into the 20th century, with the formalists and all the schools that follow them, we really have a coherent definition of literary criticism. And I want to give you guys this definition just so we all have it. I kind of said it 2 weeks ago, but I want to draw a slight distinction between criticism and theory. And we're going to talk about both. We're not going to be experts in either, but we need to know just some basic definitions. So for us, literary criticism is the analysis, interpretation, and evaluation of literary texts. And that is exactly what we are doing in this class. So like I've said, we are engaged in this kind of work. We're analyzing, we're interpreting, and ultimately we are evaluating. We're determining how effective texts are, in some cases how good they are. That is part of the larger mission. But first, we're analyzing, we're breaking down, and then we're interpreting, we're figuring out what it all means. So that's literary criticism as we know it today. Literary theory is related to criticism, but they're a little bit different. Okay, so there's a lot of overlap between the two concepts, but literary theory is a little bit different, and we're not getting into it a ton in this class. So it's really a distinct academic discipline. It borrows a lot from literary criticism, but it's a lot more influenced by philosophy and linguistics, and in some cases, even other just various social sciences. So it looks and feels a bit different from what we are doing in this class, but some of the critical approaches or schools that we're going to study can be considered theories So that's why the lines get blurry between these two terms. Some critics who write a lot and help to kind of pioneer a new critical approach, they might be considered theorists. They are kind of creating new theories for reading literature and interpreting literature. But literary theory is kind of weird, and it's not always completely centered around literature. Like I said, it borrows a lot from other disciplines, and in some cases, literary theory is actually studying literary criticism. Literary theory isn't always written about literature. It can also be written about the criticism that's written about literature. So it gets rather complex and a bit confusing. And again, sometimes if we're reading lit theory, it sounds a lot like philosophy. There is literature in there. They are looking at literature sometimes, or at least criticism about literature, but it borrows from a lot of other disciplines, and it sometimes takes us in different directions. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time with theory, but like I said, some of the critical schools that we study borrow stuff from theory and are very influenced by theory and might even be thought of as theoretical in various ways. So we'll talk about that sort of as we go along. So let's get back into our history as we move into the 20th century. Again, literature is now being studied. More types of literature are being studied in colleges and universities, and we have this growing body of literary criticism, so students have the tools they need to perform analysis and interpretation. So the first approach or school that kind of takes hold and really proves to be influential in this country is formalism. But before we get into these guys anymore, I mean, they are borrowing from some concepts that had already existed. Again, a big part of their contribution is they're pulling together pre-existing ideas and they're really making it into a system, maybe a theory, if we want to use that term. They're kind of making it more systematic. They're getting more organized. They're pulling together things and creating really an approach, a method that in many ways we still use. At least we still use parts of it today. So before they came along, there was a group of Russian critics at the very beginning of the 20th century known as the Russian formalists. And just think about this name, formalist. Think about the term form that we've already talked about in relation mostly to lyric poetry. But that word is key here because formalists are obviously very interested in the structure or the form of literary texts, how they're built, how the language works inside them. So the Russian formalists at the very turn of the 20th century were already starting to reject the historical context, all these other cultural contexts, sociological, biographical, whatever. And they were focused on language and structure. Things like rhyme and rhythm and meter if they were looking at poetry. But they're really just focused on the features of the text. And that would become true of American formalists who came along a few decades later. This kind of started at a few southern colleges and universities and then kind of spread throughout the nation. Back in the 1930s, there was a poet and critic named John Crow Ransom. And he taught at Vanderbilt University, which is in Tennessee. And he had a group of students, some of whom went on to become famous authors in their own right. Robert Penn Warren, Alan Tate, they kind of became famous later, but these guys helped to create what we call the new criticism or formalism, because again, they're breaking away from those traditional critical approaches. So for them, the historical context does not matter. The author's biography doesn't matter. They just want to focus on textual features. They want to stay inside the text. And we still do this a little bit. They help to pioneer the notion of close reading, which is a concept that still gets taught. It's still kind of a staple of literary study. And close reading is just a very close, meticulous look at specific textual features. So kind of getting a lot more granular and a lot more specific. And a lot of you might have some experience not so much doing close reading, but doing some of those more traditional methods of critical approaches, because a lot of readers gravitate towards the historical method or the biographical. And I think we know the reasons why. Those approaches can be a little bit easier in some ways. You can find the historical background. You can get the information on that. It's out there. You can find it and put it into a paper, or you can read a biography about the author. What's harder to do is analyzing specific textual features like imagery, like figurative language, like irony, or trying to figure out a particular character or a particular symbol. But that's the kind of work that the formalist wanted to do. They wanted to stay inside the text and not really worry about anything outside. That included the author, that included the history, that included the philosophy, the linguistics, whatever. They just wanted to focus on specific textual features or elements. But they also help to kind of put forward this notion that a work of literature is a work of art, and it should be appreciated and studied in that way, like a painting or a sculpture. So again, they wanted to get us away from using literature as a way to understand other areas of knowledge, other fields like history or philosophy. They wanted literature to be appreciated for what it was doing as literature, as a work of art, with a sort of internal logic. And, a work of literature has all of these different things, all these different elements that are combining to express some kind of meaning and to also just be a pleasurable experience for people. So they wanted to understand how these texts worked, how these texts functioned as works of art. So we still use a lot of their ideas. We still use close reading as a tool, as an exercise to help us engage more with the language of a text. And again, close reading gives us a chance to zero in on some specific elements or features, like a particular image, a particular symbol. Generally, we're just going to tackle a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs when we close read, or if we're looking at a poem, maybe a couple of stanzas, and we're just looking for patterns. We're looking for important or noteworthy features that we can explore and talk about and come up with ideas about. So we do a lot of the same stuff today. And they're interested in a lot of the literary elements that we've been talking about all semester. So they're very interested in imagery. They're very interested in metaphors. We've talked about those literary elements or features. They're big into symbolism. They're always hunting for symbols. So we've already talked about these features, but we know that these features often occur a lot in lyric poetry. Now, we can find them in novels, and short stories, and plays as well, but the formalists often favored lyric poetry. They were big fans of precision, this idea of like structural tightness. They valued irony. They valued some of these other elements like imagery and symbolism. So they often liked shorter texts and lyric poetry because it contains so many of these features was often what they looked at the most, but they studied all forms of literature. But they were also borrowing some ideas from the English Romantic poets, from the early 1800s. They were borrowing some ideas from Edgar Allan Poe, the famous American writer who didn't just write fiction, he also kind of wrote his own theory of writing fiction, and he argued that the best fiction, or the best literature just in general, because he wrote poetry, short stories, and one novel, he said the best literature is generally going to be short. Poe said this because it has what he called a unity of effect, which means if you can sit down and read the text in a single sitting, like a poem or a short story, if you can read the whole thing in a single sitting, the effect on the reader is going to be a lot stronger than what you would get with a novel that might take somebody a couple of weeks or even a month to read. the effect of that novel is getting diluted because it's taking the reader a long time. But if you can sit down and consume a literary text in one sitting, in a half an hour or an hour, it's going to work at its optimal level, and it's going to have a unified effect because you can remember everything that you read, essentially, and all the different elements. Poe wrote about this. He said all the elements of a text need to work together to create one overall impression or effect on readers. So, in a lot of ways, the formalists are kind of borrowing certain ideas about unity, about sort of the larger goals of a text, but their real legacy for us is just that intense focus on language and specific literary elements that can be identified, analyzed, and then you can come up with all kinds of ideas about them, which will help you ultimately to unlock your own interpretation or your own reading of the text. So they really help to kind of modernize literary study, and we still borrow a lot of their techniques. So they're also very fond of patterns. So we talked about patterns when we were looking at poetry. They were always looking for, recurring images or a recurring symbol, and obviously rhyme scheme. I mean, we can see why poetry works so well for this kind of analysis. There are so many patterns in a typical lyric poem. You can look at rhyme scheme, you can look at meter, you can look at things like assonance and alliteration, because we see the same letters in multiple words or similar vowel sounds, similar consonant sounds. So those create patterns, those create rhythms with internal rhyme. So there's, in rhyme, internal rhyme. The meter creates a pattern, but also certain words might get repeated. Certain images might appear multiple times. So they would always be interested in patterns and these kinds of features of language. So they really liked a few other things that I want to mention: tension, irony, and paradox. So we've already kind of talked a little bit about these, but these were just other things that they would look for and want to analyze, because to them, almost any successful literary text would have these things in some form. So if you looked for these things, you could usually do things with them. So we've already talked about tension a little bit within the context of our plot triangle. And generally with our rising action, some kind of tension or conflict gets introduced, and then we reach sort of a fever pitch with the climax. Usually that tension sort of comes to a head. So we're familiar with tension. It's functioning in a lot of narratives, certainly, that we read or watch. So they were interested in tension. It's really just, in their eyes, the opposition between two things, or like two opposites colliding. That might mean characters. That might mean different things in language. That might concern the plot. But somehow we have an interaction between like two opposites, two opposing sides are coming together, whether that's based on people, setting, language, anything. But they always could find some sort of tension. And then often that tension is going to be expressed through irony. So irony is a notoriously difficult word to define, and as a result, a lot of students steer clear of it. We don't always want to talk about it because we're not always sure if we're properly identifying it. But the formalists thought that a lot of literature includes irony, and there's usually importance behind the irony. And again, the irony might be the way that a lot of tension gets introduced or expressed. So for our purposes, there's actually a very simple definition of irony that we can all use. It's just when the expected outcome is the opposite of the actual outcome. So once again, opposites colliding. This is actually situational irony. There are different types, but the definition for situational kind of covers the term as a whole. The expected outcome is the opposite of the actual outcome. So just think about that. What ends up happening is the opposite of what we expected to happen at the beginning. That's the simplest definition for irony, and that is specifically situational irony. Okay, so we see that all the time. And then there's also verbal irony, best known to most people as sarcasm. Okay, so just think about sarcasm. Everybody on earth has either used a sarcastic tone of voice and thus achieved verbal irony, or at the very least, you've heard someone else do it. Not everybody is sarcastic by nature, but you've certainly heard sarcasm at some point in your life. So verbal irony is when the apparent or literal meaning of what we say is the opposite of what we mean. So think about the way sarcasm works. If you have a big paper due in a couple of days, you might say to your friend, "Oh, great, I'm really looking forward to that paper." That's obvious sarcasm. But think about how it works. It's just the basic idea of irony, this idea of opposites. What you're saying, the literal meaning of what you're saying, is the opposite of what you actually mean. What you mean is that you don't want to do the paper, you're dreading it, but what you're saying is actually the opposite of that. But you're able to make it clear to your friend through your tone of voice and maybe your facial expression. It's obvious that you're being sarcastic based on the way that you're saying it, but that is verbal irony. That's the basic idea of verbal irony. And then finally, we have dramatic irony, which is a little bit different. This gets handed down to us from the theatrical tradition, obviously, with plays. And this is when the audience knows more than one or more characters in the play. So that's a little bit of a different effect, but we can still think of it in those same general terms. We are somehow given access to information. We in the audience are given access to information that the characters up on stage don't have, or at least one key character might not have. So then we watch that character make mistakes or make false assumptions, whatever, based on the lack of knowledge that the character has, but we have more knowledge. So in some ways, our knowledge is almost like the opposite of the character's knowledge, or at least they're different. So that leads to this gap. And this leads often to big blunders on the part of the character. So that would have been very common in a lot of tragedies, like of Shakespeare's time. Fatal events that could have been avoided if the characters just knew what we knew. So that's dramatic irony, but we see the other types of irony, verbal and situational, all the time, whether it's in a work of literature or not. So with those kinds of definitions on hand, you should be able to find irony in a lot of the stuff that you read, whether it's verbal irony in the dialogue between characters or just situational irony. If you start out with one expectation as the reader, and then at the end of that scene or that chapter or that storyline, you end up with an opposite outcome, something that was the opposite of your expectation, then you know that the author was utilizing situational irony. So formalists would look for this stuff, write about this stuff. But what's also important to remember about the formalist approach, and this is where modern students and scholars kind of depart from them, is they really felt like there was only one true reading or interpretation of a literary text. They believed that if you use this sort of rigorous, very meticulous, almost scientific approach where you're looking at specific features and how they work, you're going to eventually arrive at the one true interpretation. And they really discounted authors and readers. So they came up with these two fallacies, these two common mistakes or logical errors that they claimed a lot of readers made. And a lot of critics also made these same mistakes. And they really tried to avoid this, and we're not quite as strict as them with some of this, but we do need to know the two fallacies. The first one was what's called the intentional fallacy. And a lot of us still kind of believe in this today. The formalist said we really shouldn't worry about the author's intentions. whatever the author was trying to say or trying to express in the text, that doesn't really matter, because the reader, the person who's interpreting, it's really their job to analyze and interpret. And obviously this has practical value, because if we're reading old stuff, obviously, and the author is dead, we're not going to be able to go and ask them, hey, what did you really mean in chapter 9? So we often can't really uncover the author's true intention. But you guys know, it's easy to get hung up on that. It's easy to get hung up on, well, is that what the author really meant, or is that just how I'm interpreting it? But the new critics would say it doesn't matter, right? The author created the text, but then once the text is out there in the marketplace, it becomes separate from the author. And they're not interested in anything that's outside of the text, and that includes the author. So that's the intentional fallacy. The other one is called the affective fallacy. And this is the one that a lot of people have kind of rejected in more recent times. So they would claim that we really shouldn't take emotions into account when we are studying literature. So they would say judging a text based on the emotional effect that it has on readers is the wrong approach. The formalists would say we don't want to do that. Because they would say emotions are volatile and individual people are hard to predict and hard to understand. So just because a person has a particular emotional reaction to a text, that's not really providing any insight into what the text means or what the text is doing. So they kind of wanted to take not just emotions, but the reader kind of out of it. They didn't really care that much about the personal, individual responses of readers, because again, for them, there's really only one correct reading. And if everybody's doing the right kind of sort of analytical approach, this formalist approach, then we're all going to essentially arrive at that same general meaning. So we tend to reject that today. We leave it open for multiple interpretations. We generally think that a literary text can be interpreted any number of ways, and there's not just one correct way. It's not math. It's not a hard science where there's probably going to be just one correct answer. So we have moved away from some of these beliefs. So a lot of people don't really subscribe to the affective fallacy, but a lot of literature teachers still kind of believe in the intentional fallacy. We don't typically want our students to get too hung up on worrying about what the author really meant. With really contemporary stuff where the author might be doing interviews and talking about the text, there might be some things we can do to avoid mistakes. But again, if we're reading something by Shakespeare or Homer or anybody who's dead, obviously we can't worry too much about that. We still feel that way, but we're not quite as strict as the formalists. We're not quite as rigid, but we do take a lot from them. And again, they're interested in a lot of the elements that we know. They're interested in point of view. We've talked about that. They're interested in different kinds of narrators. When they're reading fiction, they tend to prefer the omniscient third-person narrator because that's a more reliable narrator. They talk about the chaos that often gets created when we have an unreliable narrator, or even just any kind of run-of-the-mill first-person narrator, because that's a more subjective point of view. And then if we have multiple perspectives, multiple points of view, that's also going to lead to, some challenges that they try to navigate. So they're interested in point of view, imagery, various types of figurative language, symbolism, but again, patterns of any kind, which often leads them to lyric poetry and maybe shorter works of fiction. And tension, irony, and finally paradox. That's the last one. I still haven't mentioned that one. Paradox is just when we seem to have a contradiction or something that's absurd or even impossible. So again, they would claim that a lot of literature features some kind of paradox, either confronted by characters or just something that's created in the plot or something that's created by particular words or particular images, maybe in a poem. So they're always hunting for a lot of our familiar elements, but also tension, irony, and paradox, and they're looking for that one true meaning, but they're doing it in a very systematic and rigorous way. So a lot of their contributions made the study of literature more systematic and rigorous. I love close reading. We still use a lot of these same elements. We don't hunt for irony and paradox quite as much, but we certainly like a lot of the others. But we also borrow from reader response theory. So that's the other critical approach I want to mention today, because it really comes up in almost direct opposition, or at least in response to formalism. So again, formalism wants to stay inside the text, and we're rejecting anything outside of the text. We're just focused on the language of the text. We don't really care about the author. We don't really care about readers. Obviously, as the name suggests, reader response theory is a response to that, and it's a way to get readers back involved. So reader response theory developed kind of in the late 50s into the 1960s, and it was a response to the dominance of formalism. The new critics kind of had it their way for a while, and then we had increasing numbers of scholars and critics who said, we're tired of ignoring the readers. We need to take the readers into account. So now we have a different approach that really privileges readers and looks at readers as really being responsible for kind of negotiating or finding the meaning of literary texts. So we like this approach oftentimes because it gives us our modern day idea that there's more than one way to read a text. Different readers are going to arrive at different analysis and different interpretations, different evaluations, and that's fine. So they also reject the affective fallacy. They say emotions do matter. The emotional effect on readers is important. It might not be the only thing to consider, but it is important because it's part of how these texts work. It's part, in many cases, of what they mean, especially if they're designed to achieve specific emotional effects. So now we have a privileging of the reader, and a lot more focus being paid to how a reader approaches a text and how that text affects the reader. So in time, now again, just as a reminder of how thin the line is between criticism and theory, sometimes this is called reader response theory, sometimes it's called reader response criticism. But it gave rise to what's known as reception theory, which is really almost like a social science in some ways. It's basically the process of documenting a whole bunch of reader responses about a particular text or maybe even a particular author, and just sort of collecting a lot of data, a lot of reader responses, and then arriving at certain conclusions based on that data. So, okay, 80% of Stephen King readers, or, at least the majority of Stephen King readers feel this way and that way and this other way about some particular aspect of his work. So that really is kind of different from what we are doing, but it is a little bit related, very much related to reader response. But as we know it today, reader response is basically just kind of a way to empower readers and to encourage readers to, like I said, kind of negotiate and find the meaning. So we're still using these literary elements, a lot of the same textual features that the formalists were interested in. We're still interested in those. As we've seen, we are still using those, but we don't have to discount the reader now. We don't have to discount emotional responses either. So this kind of flies a little bit better with our modern sensibilities, sort of opening interpretation up and allowing different perspectives and being okay with the fact that analysis and interpretation will be subjective and somewhat relative, unlike the more scientific, objective style that the formalists were really pushing for. With reader response, it's okay if I read the Hemingway short story a little bit differently than somebody else, as long as we have a foundation for our reading. As long as we've done some analysis and we can point to evidence and reasons for our conclusions, it's okay if we differ a little bit. Because what a lot of reader response critics point out is this is really inevitable, because everybody brings a different background, different experiences, different views, different beliefs. Everybody brings those to the table whenever we sit down to read something. So obviously some of these differences between people will lead to slightly different analysis, different interpretations, and that's okay. But there's kind of a larger theoretical idea at work too, which I think is even more interesting. This idea that readers really get to decide what it is that we are reading. We really do have a lot of power. So I want to share a brief anecdote. I'll try to keep it brief. We don't have to know everything about it, but it really illustrates this idea that we're not just passive receivers of literature. We play a much more active role when we analyze and interpret. So there's this guy, Stanley Fish. He was a Harvard professor, a big proponent of reader response. And he wrote this famous, I don't know if it's a true story. He presented it as a true story. But according to him, back in the 70s, he was teaching 2 classes back to back at Harvard, and he was a guy who did many different things. So the first class was a linguistics class, the study of language. He had a background in that, and then his next class was like medieval religious poetry, or something really obscure like that, but very much religious themed literature. So yeah, he seems like the kind of guy, based on what little I know about him, that would teach 2 very different classes. He was very learned. So back-to-back classes, the first one was the linguistics class. In that class, he wrote a list of names on the board, last names only. This was a list of famous linguists, the last names of famous linguistic scholars, and he wanted his class to be familiar with them. So linguistics class ends, he forgets to erase the names from the board. Then his religious poetry class comes in. And he's not paying attention at first. According to the legend, Fish, in between classes, is trying to grade a few papers at his desk. So as his religious poetry students come in, he doesn't notice that they are looking at the names on the board, and the students just assume that this is some obscure religious poem from the Middle Ages that Fish has put on the board for them to analyze and interpret, because usually class would start with some kind of warm-up activity, and they assume that this was it. So they start, without any prompting from him, they just sit down and they start working. They start interpreting what these words might mean, these names. They don't know that they're just last names. Remember, they're in a religious poetry class. So all semester long, they've been looking at symbolism. They've been looking at figurative language. They've been sort of decoding religious texts. They've been performing exegesis in many ways, like those ancient biblical scholars. So they're used to doing that kind of work. And it just so happens, through sheer coincidence, that a bunch of the names on the board, if you're looking at them in a certain way, they do kind of sound almost religious. So they have like connections to the Bible. So I can't remember all of the names now, but one of them was Thorn. I know that one. One was Rosenbaum. One was Levin, Levin. And I can't remember the others, but the majority of the names, if you're looking at it through this particular lens, this lens of religious poetry, you could kind of read the names as having religious symbolism of some kind. So the students start performing analysis, and they basically try to figure out what each individual word is representing. So Fish eventually catches on and realizes what they're doing, but he's kind of interested to see what they come up with. So eventually he tells them, okay, this is just a list of names. It's not really a poem. But first they share their interpretations, and he's really struck at how good they are, considering that this is not a poem. It's just a relatively random list of names. But they're able to do a lot of close reading, a lot of good work. So they think that thorn might represent like the crown of thorns that Jesus had to wear. They interpret Rosenbaum as like a reference to the Virgin Mary, who I think at one point is described in the Bible as a rose without thorns. So there's an opposition, all right? The formalists would have had some fun with that. There's some kind of tension there. There's symbolism. Even with leaven, they were able to turn that into like unleavened bread, which also gets mentioned in the Bible. So I don't remember all of their other interpretations, but they had a bunch of good ones, and Fish was kind of impressed. And that just, to him, that illustrated a larger truth, which is the type of text that we are reading is largely determined by us. We often think of literature as being already predetermined, and all of these categories and definitions are set in stone, and then the literature is given to us, and we just have to find the one correct answer. That's a little bit of how the formalists would have described it. But for Fish and the people who believed in reader response, they said, no, really, if you think that you're reading a poem, for all intents and purposes, you are, in fact, reading a poem. It doesn't really matter what it actually is or what it was intended to be. So again, we're still kind of rejecting that intentional fallacy. Who cares what it was intended to be? You get to decide as the reader what it is. You get to decide what it means. You get to decide how to read it, how to analyze it, and how to interpret it. So for Fish, this really should have been empowering and sort of inspiring, liberating for his students, this idea that the reader doesn't just interpret meaning, the reader creates meaning. The reader gets to decide not just the meaning even, but perhaps the genre of literature that's being dealt with. Maybe the reader gets to decide that this non-literary text, if you remember that concept from the beginning of the semester, this non-literary text can function just like literature. It has the same kinds of features, the same kinds of literary elements that we would find in a poem. So that also helps us to expand the definition of literature, and now perhaps more things can qualify because we can find symbolism in them. We can find imagery in them. We can find hidden meanings, even if the author did not intend to have all of that in there. So very empowering for readers. We get to dictate meaning. We get to create meaning in certain cases. And at the very least, we negotiate. We find it. We make sense of it. So we do matter, despite what the formalists say. However, and this is the final thought for today, there is a danger that comes from excessive reader response criticism because as many have pointed out, we can't have an unlimited number of potential interpretations. We have to have some kind of boundary. We have to have some kind of limitation that we can place to kind of keep it all reasonable and keep it manageable. Because if it's unlimited, then it almost gets too hard to keep track of everything. And how can we even have any agreed upon meanings or larger conclusions if it's just limitless? So we have to impose some kind of limitations on the number of potential interpretations. So what a lot of reader response critics came up with was this idea of the implied reader. This idea that any author, when they sit down to write, has an implied reader, or like a virtual reader, an ideal reader in mind. Because you guys can understand, right? If you're an author and you're hoping to reach a big audience, you can't think very coherently about all the different people who might one day read your book. You can't think of that many different people. You can't imagine all the differences between them. But you can have one sort of typical reader in mind. An imaginary person, not a real person, but an imaginary person based on real people, based on the types of audience members you have in mind as you're working. So the critics would say, even if this is like subconscious or unconscious, all authors kind of do this because you have to do this. As you're working on your book, you have to have that imaginary reader in mind to sort of ask yourself, well, would the reader buy this twist in the plot? Would the reader like this character? Would the reader accept this? You always, as an author, kind of have to ask yourself some of those questions. So there's always that implied reader that kind of guides the author and helps the author to make certain decisions. So what the reader response people say is that's how we limit the number of different interpretations. We say, only the interpretations that would be arrived at by this sort of implied reader. Which for a lot of literature, like, sort of high literature, literary fiction, kind of high-minded stuff that definitely packages itself as art, we can run into some problems with this because the implied reader for a lot of that kind of stuff might be, pretty educated, somewhat sophisticated, maybe a college graduate, somebody who's a reader, obviously, somebody who reads maybe a lot, somebody who would like to read the sort of thing that this author is producing. So again, the author always has an idea, a general idea of the kind of people who might want to read this. But depending on what type of literature we're looking at, that group of implied readers might be kind of selective. It might be kind of small. And then the question comes up like, well, what if I'm reading a book, but I don't think I am the implied reader? I don't think I fall in the category of the types of readers that this author expected to read the book. Is that a problem? Does that mean I can't read it? A lot of critics would say, no, actually that can be fun and interesting in its own right. If you don't fall in that group of sort of assumed readers, then maybe your critical approach to the text will be very different from a lot of other people's. You might interpret it in a very different way because you're a different kind of reader. You have a different background, perhaps, different life experiences. So we can see how this might be a problem sometimes. In other cases, it's just kind of a necessary way to limit possible interpretations. So it only gets to be a potentially elitist thing, usually if we're thinking about high literature, stuff that goes up for big awards, the kind of stuff that we read. But for more genre-based fiction, more popular genres that a larger group of people might read, it might not really be a problem because the group of implied readers is bigger. Right, or stuff that's geared for a younger audience or just a more general audience, there might not be as many limitations. But at the same time, there has to be a way for the for the writer to sort of give people a general, things we can all agree on, things that even though we have different ways to interpret, there needs to be some common ground, some agreed upon realities or truths. So there's different ways that we can sort of find those. That's part of the fun of reader response. If we're not big fans of the idea of the implied reader, basing our limitations on the type of people who might read a text, I think we can also use literary elements and devices, these textual features, to help give us limitations. So any interpretation that we arrive at based on what we see in the text, based on imagery, figurative language, characters, all of those things, maybe that's how we limit possible interpretations. As long as your interpretation is based on elements, features of the text, and you're not just out there somewhere in left field doing something totally unconnected to the text. As long as we're staying at least somewhat in the text, looking at textual features, we can probably think that any interpretation that comes from anyone in this class is going to be valid, potentially valid, that falls within our parameters. But you can't just do anything. You have to stick with a lot of these textual features. So nowadays we combine certain aspects of formalism with certain aspects of reader response. I like a little bit of each. So we're taking some of that rigorous analytical stuff from the formalists, our close reading, our close attention to those elements and features, but we're opening things up and we're giving ourselves more power, just like the reader response people say, and we're able to create some meaning and certainly to find meaning. And if that's a little bit emotional, that's okay, but we still want to use a lot of those textual features that the formalists were so fond of. Okay, so that's it for today. We'll move on to a couple of new critical approaches next week. So if you have any questions or if any of this stuff is giving you trouble, just get in touch with me and also use the notes that I'm posting in the weekly modules. And I'll see you next week.